Napoleon Bonaparte. No matter who you are or where you're from, you've definitely heard the name. You might know that he was a military leader and emperor of France, but you probably don't know what made him a military genius or how exactly he forever changed the art of warfare during his conquests of Europe. For it was under his leadership that the French army rose to become the most powerful and effective army in Europe in the years following the French Revolution, leaving an everlasting mark in history and forever changing the world. Now, in order to understand the power and effectiveness of the French army during these times, one must examine the history leading up to and occurring during these times. Prior to Napoleon's rise to power, the French Revolution broke out in the early 1790s. Control of France was assumed by the Directory, which imposed a strict and unforgiving rule of terror that guillotined almost anyone accused of being an enemy of the new republic. For the French army, this meant that all pre-existing officers that had received their appointments as members of the aristocracy were now discharged or executed, leaving many leadership positions waiting to be filled. At the same time, the monarchs of many other European countries began to see the French Revolution in France as a dangerous threat to their power and way of life. In response to their growing concern about the revolution, many of them declared war on France and attempted to launch invasions with the goal of restoring France's former monarchy. As French armies were deployed in defense, the perfect opportunities arose for a young French artillery officer from Corsica. Yes, it was during this time that Napoleon Bonaparte, a fervent supporter of the revolution, began to rise through the ranks of the French army following his military successes against France's enemies. Battle after battle, he led the French army to victory, while reforming its organization and tactics as he got promoted to higher and higher ranks. The new French government, however, was crumbling. Its original leaders had been executed for treason, and a power vacuum was starting to emerge. Seizing the opportunity, Napoleon used his position in the military to remove what was left of the Directory and take control of France, eventually crowning himself emperor. This set the stage for a long period of wars soon to follow, as the great monarchs of Europe led their armies into battle against Napoleon's newly reformed French army, now known as La Grande Armée. In a series of successive wars, La Grande Armée clashed with the other armies of Europe, winning the vast majority of its battles and forever changing the course of history. Now, it is important to remember what armies were like at this time and how battles were fought. To put it simply, these were the days of muskets, horses, and cannons, when soldiers would all stand together in long lines and take turns shooting at each other across open fields until one side decided that enough of their men had died and elected to either run away or surrender. As you can probably tell, this style of warfare led to heavy casualties, which meant that every battle was critical to the outcome of a war. Armies at this time had three main components: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The infantry was the main fighting force of every army, composed of foot soldiers that were usually equipped with muskets. The cavalry was composed of soldiers on horseback, generally equipped with pistols and sabers. Its job was to deal decisive blows to the weak parts of an enemy army, as well as to gather intelligence about the enemy's position and numbers. The artillery focused on blasting holes into enemy lines to weaken their forces, as well as providing cover fire for friendly units. It was generally composed of soldiers equipped with different sized cannons. In light of all this, I will be arguing that the French army during the Napoleonic era was the most effective out of all its European counterparts because of its leadership under Napoleon, its organizational structure, and the specific battle tactics it used during military engagements. In case you can't tell already, Napoleon played a major part in the French army during the Napoleonic era, and thus a major part in its victories. He made the French army as powerful as it was through his own leadership, personal qualities, and reforms. He was able to lead the French army effectively by establishing a personal connection to his men. He did this in several different ways. First, he would often take part in battles by leading from the front rather than the rear. In the Battle of Lodi, for example, Napoleon personally led a charging column of French infantry across a bridge and straight into enemy fire, proving to his soldiers that he was one of their own. Another way he established a connection to his men was by making considerable efforts to evacuate the wounded during his campaign in Egypt and by generally keeping his men well fed and supplied. It was through acts such as these that he gained his soldiers' respect and loyalty. The second thing that made Napoleon such a good leader was his personal traits. He had an excellent memory which allowed him to remember the names of many of his soldiers, further deepening his connection to them. He also had a great ability of quickly analyzing and intuitively understanding the various elements of the battlefield, like quickly assessing the balance of force, strength, and weakness both before and during battle. This allowed him to put the French army in the best possible position to win battles. Furthermore, he could work for long hours with little sleep, and he had excellent social skills. Part of the reason he was able to rise to power so quickly was because he seemed to please everyone he came across. Lastly, Napoleon was able to lead the French army in a highly effective manner because of the reforms he instituted into it. He did things like bringing back the medals of honor for heroism in battles, which had previously been removed during the French Revolution. He also made some of these medals open to all ranks, such as the Legion of Honor. This inspired his men and gave them motivation and morale in battles. Additionally, Napoleon promoted soldiers based on merit and success rather than social class, which meant his generals and battlefield commanders were top par and highly experienced. He also kept the French army well supplied, opening new munitions factories and reforming the production of artillery. All in all, Napoleon's leadership through a personal connection to his troops, his personal traits, and the reforms he instituted gave the French army a major advantage in battle and made it considerably more powerful. Another important reason why the French army was the most effective out of all its European counterparts during the Napoleonic era was its organizational structure. When Napoleon seized power in 1799, he began to alter the organization and grouping of different units within the French army. Originally, the French army, like many other armies of Europe, lacked organization on a larger scale. Its highest grouping was the demi-brigade, made up of 2,400 men that consisted of a hodgepodge of infantry and a few artillery guns. This meant that armies moved as one, slow, lumbering mass of soldiers formed into a few basic demi-brigades, which had to stick together for fear of being isolated and destroyed by a larger enemy force. However, when Napoleon took over full command of the French army, he did a complete overhaul of the demi-brigade system and instituted a new corps system. This new system split the French army up into different corps of about 15 to 30,000 soldiers, with each corps containing its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supporting staff, which included reconnaissance, engineers, and medical services. All in all, each corps was effectively a mini army that could maneuver and fight independently for varying amounts of time. This corps system meant that the French army could remain widely dispersed when marching, yet could also quickly concentrate for a major battle. Additionally, it allowed the army to cover ground more quickly when marching, since it could advance along multiple roads and live off the land around different towns, rather than relying on a slow-moving supply train. This also helped disguise the French army's intentions and confused its enemies, since it made the French army often appear to be in many places at once. The advantage this corps system gave to the French army can be seen in Napoleon's campaign against Austria in 1805. At the Battle of Ulm, the mobility of the French corps allowed them to cross the Danube River and outflank the Austrian army, eventually forcing the Austrians to surrender and allowing the French to take nearly 60,000 prisoners. The advantage of the French corps system can also be seen at the Battle of Friedland, where a large Russian army spotted a seemingly isolated French corps and attempted to destroy it. The lone French corps was able to hold its own for an entire day, utilizing its strong mix of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, while the other French corps rushed to the battlefield and were then able to crush the entire Russian army. Over Overall, the French army's corps system was the reason for its success in many battles, and it was so successful that it was adopted by many other European nations in the years after Napoleon's banishment. While both Napoleon's leadership and the French army's corps system were major components of the effectiveness of the French army, it also succeeded because of the tactics it used during battle. Its first main battle strategy was known as the maneuver to the rear. For this tactic, one unit or corps of the French army would engage the enemy forces, pinning them down and forcing them to give battle, while the other French forces would outflank the enemy and cut off their line of escape. Oftentimes, this allowed the French army to win a decisive and complete victory, or it forced the enemy to order a hastened retreat before their escape route was lost. Examples of this tactic being used successfully by the French army are at the battles of Ulm, Marengo, Jena, and Friedland. The next battle tactic used by the French army was known as the central position. For this tactic, the French army would attempt to split the enemy army in two and keep them divided, hoping to defeat each independently. Before or during battle, the French army's advance guard would usually rush forward between two sections of an enemy army. Then, one corps would be sent to engage one section of the enemy army with the French advance guard, while the other corps of the French army would overwhelm the second section of the enemy army. After the other French corps crushed the second section of the enemy army, they would swing around to support the advance guard and single corps that were engaging the first section of the enemy army. The main example of the success of this tactic can be seen at the dual battle of Jena-Auerstedt in 1806. During this battle, the French used the central position tactic to brutally defeat the Prussian army. During the battle, the 3rd French Corps, commanded by Marshal Davout, held off one section of the Prussian army at the town of Auerstedt, while the other French corps under Napoleon's command crushed the Prussians at Jena. With the Prussian forces split, they were unable to reinforce each other and were defeated, leaving the French army with another victory to add to its list. The third and final battle tactic used by the French army was surprisingly the frontal assault. For this tactic, the entire French army, with the exception of the Guard reserve forces, would attack all at once, putting pressure on the entire enemy line. Eventually, when the whole enemy line was weakened, the Guard reserve forces would be sent in to attack the weakest point, breaking through the enemy line and surrounding it from behind. This tactic was used by the French at both the Battle of Wagram in 1809 and Borodino in 1812. It was an effective strategy that allowed the French army to win both battles, but it came at a very heavy cost. Casualties were often very high since it required the entire French army to advance headlong into enemy fire. All in all, however, the French army's three main battle strategies, the maneuver to the rear, central position, and frontal assault, allowed it to win victory after victory against all other armies in Europe. Of the 37 battles the French army fought under Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars, it won 30 of them, giving it a battle win rate of 81%, making it vastly superior to the other European armies at the time, who usually won less than half the battles they fought. So what have we learned? Well, over the course of this video, I've shown how the French army was superior to its European counterparts during the Napoleonic era because of its leadership under Napoleon, its organizational structure, and its battle tactics and strategies. We saw how Napoleon reformed the French army specifically through promotions based on merit and leading from the front rather than the rear. We saw how the French army's organizational structure of the corps system allowed it a greater degree of mobility, independence, and overall strength. And lastly, we saw how the French battle tactics of maneuver to the rear, central position, and frontal assault allowed the French army to outflank, outnumber, and ultimately defeat its enemies. But at this point, you're probably wondering how any of this bears any relevance to you in today's era. I mean, if you're not a historian who specializes in the Napoleonic era, why should you care about why the French army was superior to its European counterparts at the time? Well, believe it or not, the connection is relatively simple. We fight our own battles every day against the work, problems, and other obstacles in our daily lives. Every day, you get up in the morning and have to deal with either work or school, problems in your life, and challenges to your success. We all have ways of coping with these adversities, such as procrastination, giving up, or attempting to just struggle through it. But what if we approach these obstacles differently? What if we learn from the success of the French army during the Napoleonic era and use similar tactics to fight the battles we fight today? What if, like Napoleon, we were the leaders of our lives, leading ourselves and others toward healthy habits and good relationships, inspiring those in the world around us and being the initiator of positive change in our lives? What if, like the French Army's core system, we introduced planning and organization into our lives so that we could balance work and free time, obligations and hobbies? And lastly, what if we approached our work with effective methods for completing it, like the French Army's strategies in battle? What if we combined critical thinking with good planning, working to overcome what's holding us back and finding healthy ways to cope with the things we struggle with the most? I mean, if these are the reasons why the French Army was so successful, can they not make us successful too?